Kara Banks just wanted a quiet life. But when two fake HOA enforcers broke into her home demanding money, her peace was shattered. Mark Lanson and Jared Connolly, hiding behind stolen uniforms and forged authority, thought they could intimidate and walk away unpunished. But Carrara had one final move and the strength to fight back when it mattered most. Stay with this gripping story to see how courage turned the tables and justice struck exactly where it was needed. Kara Banks hadn't planned to end up in Eastwood, Texas. The choice wasn't born out of ambition or dreams. It was necessity, pure and simple. After the divorce, when her life felt like it had been scraped raw, she needed somewhere small, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would look at her with pity or curiosity. Eastwood was perfect for that. A quiet pocket of the world forgotten by time, where the streets bore names like Willow Lane and Cottonwood Drive, and the biggest excitement in town was the seasonal bake sale at the community center. Carrara's new home sat at the very edge of a cul-de-sac, a modest stone-story house with peeling white paint and a porch that creaked under its own weight. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She poured her soul into making it a place of peace. On weekends, she would wander the small local nursery, picking out seeds and saplings, choosing carefully hardy plants that could survive the Texas sun and her amateur hands. Daisies quickly became her favorites. Their stubborn cheerfulness felt like a quiet rebellion against everything she had lost. Every morning, Kara would step outside with her chipped ceramic mug filled with too bitter coffee and sit on the old porch swing that swayed ever so slightly in the warm breeze. The world around her would still be waking up, birds chirping, sprinklers hissing, sunlight filtering through thick branches overhead. It was during those moments that she allowed herself to believe she was healing. The steady rhythm of a simple life, chores, gardening, the soft murmur of local radio stitched her back together, one slow day at a time. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous. There were no grand plans written on the walls of her mind. No burning ambition keeping her awake at night. Carrara only wanted to be left alone, to live without fear or judgment. In Eastwood, she thought she had found a place where the worst was already behind her. The neighbors were friendly but distant, the kind of people who nodded at you from across the lawn but rarely asked personal questions. There was comfort in their polite distance, comfort in the predictability of small-town life. But peace, Kara would soon learn, is fragile. It is not a fortress, but a garden. And gardens are vulnerable. Vulnerable to storms. Vulnerable to the shadows that drift between the trees when no one is looking. Sometimes darkness doesn't announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it knocks politely at your door, waiting for you to let it in. And for Kara Banks, the knocking had already begun. Saturday mornings had a certain rhythm for Kara Banks. Coffee, garden, maybe a trip to the farmer's market if she felt ambitious. But that morning was different. The knocking, no. The pounding at her door shattered the fragile peace she had built. It wasn't the casual tap of a neighbor or the hurried fist of a delivery driver. It was hard, demanding, measured in a way that said, "You don't have a choice." Kara jolted upright from the couch where she had dozed off reading. The room was still half-drenched, in early morning light, and for a moment she thought she had dreamed it. Then another set of pounding thuds rattled the doorframe. She moved cautiously, heart thudding in her chest. From behind the curtains, she could make out two men standing on her porch. They wore black polo shirts with HOA security stitched in bold white, letters across their chests. Neither smiled. Their postures were stiff, their arms crossed, not like protectors, but like enforcers. A voice barked through the door. "Open up. Cody violations. Immediate inspection." The words were sharp, mechanical, almost rehearsed. Something about the way they spoke, flat, aggressive, tightened the knot of fear growing in her stomach. Kara hesitated. Her mind raced. There was no official Homeowners Association in Eastwood. She remembered that detail clearly from when she signed the papers. No dues, no board, no inspections. Something was wrong. Every instinct she had screamed for her to stay quiet, to pretend she wasn't home. But the pounding came again. Louder, harder. Another voice, harsher this time. "We can see you." Open the door now. Frozen between fear and confusion, Kara made a decision she would later replay 1,000 times over. She unlocked the door and cracked. It opened just an inch, just enough to speak, to ask for identification, to buy herself time to think. She barely managed to say, "Can I help you?" before the men pushed hard. The door slammed into her shoulder, sending her stumbling backward. The two strangers swept into her living room without invitation, without hesitation, like they owned every inch of the space. One of them, taller with short cropped hair and a hard expression, began barking new orders. The other, heavier set, scanned the room with a cold, assessing gaze. Carrara stumbled to her feet, breath caught in her throat. They didn't act like security officers. They didn't act like anyone official. They acted like men who were used to taking what they wanted. Carrara's hands trembled as she tried to gather her thoughts, to find her voice, to demand answers. But deep inside, she already knew this wasn't about code violations. This wasn't about rules or inspections. It was about power. And in that moment, standing alone in her tiny living room, Kara Banks realized that her quiet life, the one she had fought so hard to rebuild, was no longer hers to protect with words alone. Something terrible had entered her world, and it wasn't leaving without a fight. The moment the men crossed the threshold, everything about them changed. Gone was any pretense of professionalism. They moved through Carrara's living room like they owned it, as if her home, her life, were simply obstacles to be pushed aside. Without asking permission, without saying a word, they began rifling through her belongings. Mail scattered across the floor. A pile of neatly folded blankets toppled from the couch. They opened drawers, knocked over picture frames, and peered into every corner with a casual disregard that made Kara's skin crawl. "You've been racking up violations for months," the taller one said, sneering. He waved a crumpled piece of paper, something hastily printed with no real letterhead, in front of her face. "Overgrown lawn, unauthorized paint color, fence too high. You owe us. Let's see." He paused, smirking. "About $3,000. Kara blinked, stunned. She had no idea what he was talking about. Her lawn was trimmed. Her fence had been there since she bought the house, and there was still no HOA, no one to issue these so-called fines. Confusion fought with the cold spike of fear rising inside her. This must be a mistake," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The shorter man, stocky, bald, and wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, stepped closer. "Mark Lanson." He grabbed her wrist sharply, the way someone might grab an unruly child. Kara gasped as his grip tightened, fingers digging into her skin. Pain flared, bright and immediate. "You think you can just ignore the rules?" he said, low and mocking. His breath was sour. His eyes glittered with something worse than anger. Enjoyment. At the same time, his partner Jared Connolly, lanky and restless, with a jittery energy that made Carrara's heart pound faster, wandered toward Thesmal's shelf where she kept her most precious keepsakes. Without hesitation, he picked up a framed photograph, a picture of Carrara and her father, taken long before life had knocked the light out of her smile. For a brief second, Kara thought he might study it, maybe even put it back. Instead, Jared casually hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered on impact, the photo crumpling under the wreckage. The sound of breaking glass seemed to echo in Carrara's chest. It wasn't just a picture. It was a piece of her history, a memory, a link to a life she was trying so hard to hold on to. Shock rooted her to the ground. Her heart raced. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but her body refused to move. She felt trapped in her own skin, like a bird staring down the open jaws of a predator. Around her, the two men continued to tear apart the sanctuary she had built for herself, each careless gesture cutting deeper than the last. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the shock, something began to stir. A slow, burning ember of anger. Small at first, but growing with every cruel smile, every shattered memory, every second they stayed in her home. Kara Banks had spent months rebuilding her life piece by fragile piece, and now these strangers were trying to tear it all down, laughing while they did it. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated her. For a few heartbeats, Kara Banks couldn't move. The world around her blurred. Voices became distant. Movements slowed. It was as if time itself hesitated, holding its breath. Fear had wrapped itself around her so tightly that for a moment it was the only thing she could feel. Heavy, suffocating. But fear is a strange thing. Sometimes it freezes you. Sometimes, if pressed hard enough, it burns itself away, leaving something far more dangerous behind. Mark Lanson stood over her, waving a crumpled piece of paper, the so-called fine notice, like a weapon. He sneered as he pressed it against her face, the sharp edge scraping her cheek. "Cash," he barked, "or get out now." The words, the tone, the sheer contempt in his voice. It struck something deep inside Kara. Something old, something tired of being afraid, of being small, of being powerless. It wasn't just about a day. It was about every moment she had been pushed aside. Every time someone decided her voice didn't matter, her safety didn't matter, her life didn't matter. And in that instant, the fear began to melt, replaced by something hotter, heavier rage. Not the loud, reckless kind, but a deep, cold fury rising up from a place inside her that she hadn't touched in years. Not again, she thought. Never again. Carrara didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply stood there, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like a second skin. Her mind flashed to the nightstand in her bedroom, to the small, carefully hidden handgun her best friend Ellie had given her after the divorce. "Just in case, honey," Ellie had said with a sad smile. "You never know." Kara had almost forgotten about it, almost convinced herself she would never need it. But a day was different. Today, the nightmare wasn't in her head. It was standing in her living room, tearing her life apart piece by piece. Without showing a flicker of her intent, Kara took a slow, shaky step backward toward the hallway that led to her bedroom. The men barely noticed. They were too busy gloating, too certain of their power. Kara moved carefully, keeping her breathing even, her eyes low, disguising the fire building behind them. The breaking point wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream or a sudden outburst. It was silent. It was a choice, and Kara Banks had made hers. She would no longer stand frozen in her own home. She would no longer allow fear to be the loudest voice in the room. She would fight. Kara knew she had only seconds. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, to fight, to do anything but stay frozen. But against two stronger men, standing, and fighting empty-handed wasn't survival. It was surrender. So she did the only thing she could. She let herself fall, collapsing onto the floor. Kara covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling. From the outside, it looked like she was breaking. Down. Exactly what they expected. Exactly what she needed them to believe. Sobs racked her body, some real, some forced, as she began inching her way across the hardwood floor. Each movement was a battle between fear and purpose, between terror and resolve. Mark noticed first. With a mocking laugh, he gave her a light kick to the ribs. Not hard enough to injure, just enough to humiliate. "Where do you think you're going, sweetheart?" He taunted, his voice thick with condescension. Carrara didn't answer. She didn't even look up. She kept crawling, slow, deliberate, toward the narrow hallway leading to her bedroom. Every inch she moved felt like a mile. She reached the doorway. Her bedroom looked untouched, quiet, almost out of place compared to the chaos in her living room. A safe harbor, if only for a moment longer. With shaking hands, Kara pushed herself up just enough to lunge toward the nightstand. The small drawer stuck slightly, resisting her desperate tug. For a split second, panic threatened to know her, but then it gave way. Underneath a stack of unpaid bills and a few old letters, her fingers brushed against cold steel. The Smith & Wesson, the gift she had promised herself she would probably never need. Now it felt like a lifeline. Kara wrapped her fingers around the grip, feeling its reassuring weight anchor her. The trembling in her hands didn't stop, but it changed. It wasn't the trembling of helplessness anymore. It was the trembling of adrenaline, of awakening. For the first time that morning, she wasn't just surviving. She was taking back control. Kara, rose to her knees, clutching the pistol close to her chest, her mind sharpening with every heartbeat. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her. Now it fueled her. In the next few seconds, everything would change again. But this time, she wouldn't be the one left powerless. Mark moved toward her with the same lazy confidence he had worn all morning, certain once again that he had nothing to fear. But this time he was wrong. Without hesitation, Kara raised the pistol. Her hands still shook, her vision blurred by a storm of fear, rage, and pure adrenaline. But she pulled the trigger. The first shots tore through the air, missing their mark. One punched a hole through the drywall. The other shattered a lamp beside the couch. The sharp crack of gunfire filled the small house, loud and final, like a gavel slamming. Down. Mark hesitated just for a heartbeat, and that was enough. Kara adjusted her aim, steadier now. The next shot struck true. It caught Mark in the shoulder, spinning him backward with a grunt of shock. The impact sent him staggering into the wall where he slumped down, clutching his arm. Before Kara could even think, Jared lunged toward her, wild, desperate. Another shot rang out. This one struck his thigh, cutting his charge short and dropping him to the floor with a cry. In a matter of seconds, the entire balance of power inside the house had shifted. The two men who had stormed in with mocking smiles now crawled across the floor, scrambling for the door, desperate to escape the very fear they'd once tried to plant in her. They left streaks across the polished wood, not just from their frantic movements, but from the weight of their own downfall. Kara didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. She followed them step by measured step, the pistol steady in her hands. She wasn't aiming to hurt them further. She aimed at the floor near them. Each shot a warning, a command. You don't get to walk away untouched. You don't get to erase what you've done. Every shot that struck the floorboards drove them faster, made them beg, made them feel for the first time what true helplessness tasted like. Tears blurred Carrara's vision, but other hands stayed steady now. She wasn't firing out of vengeance. She wasn't firing out of rage. She was reclaiming her home, her safety, her life. And with every shot, every step, she carved the fear out of herself, one bullet at a time. By the time the men reached the front door, they were no longer figures of threat or out authority. They were crawling, begging, defeated, exactly as they had wanted her to be. But Carrara Banks was no one's victim. Not anymore. The sirens reached Kara's ears like a distant memory at first. Unreal, ghostly. But with each second, the sound grew sharper, cutting through the heavy, stunned silence that had fallen inside her house. Flashing red and blue lights danced across her walls, growing brighter closer. Tires screeched against asphalt. Car doors slammed. Boots pounded the ground. Commands were shouted short and sharp by voices that carried a weight Kara immediately recognized. Real authority. Not the false, menacing kind that had stormed her home hours ago, but the steady trained voices of real officers doing their duty. Kara, Banks, if you can hear me, make yourself visible and put down any weapons. She stood in the center of her living room, gripping the pistol with both hands, her arms rigid from tension. Her heart hammered against Harib's. She wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes, hours, a lifetime. But her body felt carved from stone. The two men, Mark and Jared, lay sprawled on the floor. They no longer threatened. They whimpered, shifted, clutched their wounds. The arrogance they had worn like armor was gone, stripped away by the simple truth of failure. Kara forced herself to breathe, one slow, shaking breath after another. The front door burst open with a sharp crash. Several officers, faces hidden behind shields and vests, swept into the house in a smooth, practiced formation. Guns raised, scanning for threats. Kara turned toward them slowly, very slowly. She placed the pistol down carefully on the battered coffee table, stepping back with trembling hands raised high. The officers rushed forward, securing the weapon, assessing the room, shouting for backup, for medical teams. One officer moved directly toward her, his stance careful but not aggressive, his eyes watching hers. "It's okay now, ma'am. You're safe," he said, voice low but clear. Only then did Carrara feel the full weight of what had happened. Her knees buckled. She stumbled back against the wall, sliding down to the floor. The blanket of adrenaline that had sustained her evaporating into exhaustion. She watched almost detached as the officers took control, securing Mark and Jared in handcuffs, calling in paramedics, photographing the scene, noting the bullet holes, the broken glass, the scattered personal belongings. Neighbors gathered at the edge of her lawn, keeping a respectful distance. Some whispered, some simply stared. Most wore the same expression, a mix of fear, awe, and sympathy. Kara pulled her knees to her chest and buried her face in her arms. She was safe. She knew that. But safety didn't come with instant relief. It came with the crushing weight of everything she had survived. A detective approached her after a time, kneeling down so their yezs were level. She was a woman, maybe a few years older than Kara, with a calm, steady gaze. "Take your time," the detective said gently. "We need your statement, but only when you're ready." Kara nodded numbly. Words still felt impossible, but slowly, piece by piece, she would find them. Over the next few hours, investigators moved through the house like quiet shadows. They documented everything. They listened patiently as Kara haltingly told her story, her voice breaking once or twice when she spoke of the photo, her father's photo, shattered on the floor. They asked about the gun. Kara showed them her permit. They asked about the intruders. She described the fake HOA security shirts, the demands for money, the threats. The evidence spoke louder than any testimony. The counterfeit documents, the lack of any official HO records for the neighborhood, the bruises on Carrara's wrist, their recordings from a neighbor's porch camera that captured the shouting and chaos. Everything fit. Everything confirmed her story. And so, when the detective returned to her hours later, crouching again by her side, there was no hesitation in her voice. "You acted lawfully," she said firmly. "You defended yourself against an unlawful entry and credible threat. You are not facing any charges." Carol let the words wash over her, trying to believe them. Somewhere deep inside, a knot of fear began to loosen. Outside, the sun had started to sink below the rooftops, casting the quiet streets of Eastwood in soft gold. The flashing police lights still painted her house in colors of chaos, but the chaos inside her, that wild spiraling fear, had begun to ebb. Slowly, carefully, Carrara stood. An officer handed her a bottle of water. Another draped a blanket around her shoulders, as if to shield her from the evening chill. Neighbors remained gathered across the street. They didn't whisper now. They didn't stare. Some of them bowed their heads. Some offered small, silent waves, respect, gratitude. Because whether Kara Banks felt like it yet or not, today she'd stood her ground. Today she had survived. Today she had reclaimed her life. And though the road ahead would not be easy, she knew this much for certain. She would walk standing tall. The truth unraveled quickly after the police arrived. Mark Lanson and Jared Connolly weren't real officers. They were former private security guards fired years earlier for misconduct. Since then, they had built a scheme, forging badges, stitching fake uniforms, and terrorizing homeowners with threats of made-up violations and fake fines. They targeted those they thought were vulnerable, the elderly, the isolated, the ones they believed would be too afraid to resist. It had worked for a while until they chose the wrong door. At the trial, the evidence spoke louder than any accusation. Fake HOA documents, stolen designs for badges, testimonies from other victims who finally found the courage to speak. Kara attended every hearing. She never missed a single day. From the front row, she watched in silence as every lie was exposed, every false claim dismantled. Mark and Jared sat at the defense table, no longer arrogant. Their shoulders sagged, their heads hung low. When the guilty verdict came, fraud, impersonation, attempted extortion, the judge didn't hesitate. 15 years each with no parole for the first 10. As the two men were led away in handcuffs, Kara remained seated, steady, composed. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She had already won the only victory that mattered. They had tried to take her power, and she had taken it back. When the final gavel fell and the courtroom doors closed behind her, Kara Banks knew it was truly over. She drove home through streets she'd once feared she might never feel safe in again. The familiar turns, the overgrown sidewalks, the small houses. Everything looked the same. And yet everything felt different, like waking up from a storm to find the world washed clean. When she pulled into her driveway, the house stood quietly waiting for her. the same sagging porch, the same sun-faded siding. But to Carrara, it no longer looked fragile. It looked strong, unbreakable. She stepped out of the car, her feet crunching softly against the gravel. The afternoon sun bathed the neighborhood in a warm, golden light. Birds sang somewhere nearby, and the scent of fresh-cut grass floated in the breeze. As she climbed the porch steps, Carrara hesitated. The living room still bore the scars of what had happened. Bullet holes in the drywall, cracks in the picture. Frames, faint stains on the wooden floor where the chaos had left its mark. They would take time to fix, maybe longer than she wanted. But somehow, those scars no longer frightened her. They were part of her story now, and she was still standing. Then she saw them. A simple bundle resting carefully against her front door. Flowers. Not expensive, not grand, just a hand-picked bouquet of fresh daisies tied with a piece of twine. There was no card, no name. But Carrara didn't need one. They were from her neighbors, the people who had watched from behind their windows, who had whispered and wondered, and who now quietly offered their respect. The same daisies she had planted in her own backyard when she first came here, hoping for a fresh start. Cara picked up the bouquet and held it close. For a long moment, she stood there on the porch, eyes closed, breathing in the simple, sweet scent. And for the first time in months, a real smile, small but certain, crossed her face. She hadn't asked for a fight. She hadn't wanted to become someone's story of defiance. But when the monsters came to her door, she had stood her ground. She had fought for her life, her home, her right to live in peace. And now this place, every battered wall, every cracked floorboard, every quiet sunrise belonged to her fully without fear. This home was hers. This peace was hers forever. Purse,